series. And as our first in the series, I'm especially excited to welcome Melanie Olde, who, as their bio states, is a weaver, researcher, teacher, and artist. She uses cellular structures for form, function, and array to interpret these in biomimetic moving. So I'll let you read the rest on your own, because I just want to say a few things about what excited me and us about Melanie's practice. And now I've gone totally blank because there's so many things I'm thinking of. But I think Melanie's practice does a really excellent job of bridging the imaginative space between kind of robotic form and three-dimensional shape, and really rooted in practices of weaving. So for me, I see it as a vision of kind of what technology could be if we started it from the cloth, from looms, and from weaving. And for that reason, I was really excited to have her kick off the first talk. And we also should give her a very special welcome and thank you for calling in from Australia, which has different time zones. But with that, Melanie, I want to turn it over to you. And maybe while I do that, we can do the little Zoom hand clapping or the real in-person clapping. All right, so here we go. And Mel, you're still muted. Not sure if you're talking.
Oh, hello. Sorry about that. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Can you see that okay?
Looks great, Mel.
Yeah. Okay. So
there is a little black bar, Mel, from I think what is your Zoom, where your Zoom features are. Yep, just so you know.
Okay, terrific. So thanks so much to both Laura and Stephen and the Unstable Design Lab. It's really amazing to be here, to be talking with everybody. I'd just like to start though by acknowledging our traditional owners of the land that I'm on today in Australia, the Ngunnawal people and also the Kamilaroi people whose land I grew up on. I'd like to pay my respects to Aboriginal people, country, culture, and the ongoing relationship they have with the land. So I've been a weaver here in Australia for most of my life, since I was about 4 years old. But sort of zooming on through a lot of that, about 10 years ago, I started to become a bit burnt out from a lot of production hand weaving with only a little bit of creative exploration. So about 5 years ago, I decided to really find out how far I could push myself and my creative weaving ideas. And I have to say, I've never felt quite as exhilarated just by letting my brain free a little bit, or more than a little bit. And I think it's been, I have to admit, being reflecting through the contact with Laura and the Unstable Design Lab, I've realized that the most fun I have is really in experimenting. It's really made me think about that a lot more. So it's finding out where an idea can travel if you just let it. I think because of how I've grown up with weaving from such a young age, I do really think about it as more of a language. I can probably sometimes explain my ideas better by weaving, which is probably why I have so many images for you to look at this morning. So to describe what experimental weaving is for me, it's really curiosity-led, controlled, but with chance, and a lot of chance put in there. It's starting out with an idea or a direction, but having a state of mind to really notice the what if moments, and really questioning everything as you're going. It's like you want to be thinking, how can I do that, instead of worrying about if it can be done. I think sometimes it's ignoring what you think the direction is, to look at all the possibilities. And I always picture that in my mind as sort of like a branching tree. But still, I mean, whether it's a structured or spontaneous, it's just all fun, really. And embracing that kind of experimental play with weaving. So in my talk today, I'll take you on some of the experimental paths I've taken from sort of flat cloth weaving to a lot of 3D weaving. Most of my work is 3D at the moment. And as Laura was saying, it's mostly looking at plant cells and to 3D weaving to robotics, soft robotics, that sort of thing. And it's pretty much ordered in a timeline, so you can hopefully see a development of ideas into experiments and more ideas and permutations. So I thought I would start off with telling about some of the tools that I use. My home weaving workshop is in our shed, where there's just enough space for my AVL loom and some storage, but it works pretty well. My AVL is a 24 shaft CompuDobby with 3 back beams, so that gives me plenty of play space for different tensioning. And it's about 6 foot in width, so it can really, if I need to go big, I can go big. Most of the time at the moment, they're pretty small. So the other picture there is a very messy desk space, which periodically takes over the house. My husband's very forgiving about all of that. He's actually encouraging and yeah, gets quite involved as well. So and that picture above, up on the top right, you'll see is a picture of an ARM loom, and that's at ANU workshop, Australian National University workshop, textiles workshop. It's a 24 shaft ARM. They're really lovely little looms to use. It's got a massive warp on there, which was challenging. So I'm doing my master's there at the moment, very, very slowly, and also doing a little bit of sessional teaching as well. So between the home and university workshops, it means I can be pretty flexible with how I work, but still have the benefits of uni. And one of the things I really love about being involved more in uni is just that feedback and engagement that you can get. And most important, I think, is the interdisciplinary connections within that. So I've been chatting with people from applied maths and engineering and lots of different art disciplines. And I find that hugely valuable. So I'll move on to the next one. The other thing I thought I'd go through first is some of the visualization tools that I use. On the left there, I just need a quick drink. On the left there, you'll see a graphic from, it's a really specific 3D weaving software package called TextGen, and it's open source from the University of Nottingham. And if you like tinkering around with software, I'd go for it. It's super powerful, and if you know a little bit of Python, it also helps. But that one is definitely worth poking around with. And the middle at the top is, I had to put in AutoCAD the Unstable Design Lab offers this really unique way of looking at and constructing drafts. And I really want a lot more time to play about with that, particularly some of the generative functions I know is going on in there. The image below is just some standard weaving software. I use WeavePoint at home and at uni. The top right image is an example of, I take a lot of photos and manipulate them afterwards. And I find it really valuable just as a research tool for looking at my work. It really gives you a different perspective. You can tweak things, you can move things. In this one, I was playing with color shifting and really seeing what impact that had with the depth of the fabric. And it just all keeps feeding in to my practice. The other one on the bottom right there is a little example of some 3D printing I was playing with. That's with some flexible filament. And I was using it to really explore this particular structure, which I'll get to further. But just having the structure in my hands, even though it wasn't the woven part, it just helped me really think about and watch how this was behaving, and think about how that might work in cloth. So there's a lot of different ways of visualizing and experimenting with those visualizations to have it feed back into work. So the next one, it's all about what my driver and my inspiration is to really prompt me to the structures that I make. And I really, for a long time, and I always keep coming back to it, I'm looking at plants as functioning self-assembling cloth. So if you look at a leaf, it's really quite a blade of grass. It's really quite cloth-like. And I'm continually fascinated with that sort of mimicry of life systems. And with the cellular aspects here, it's taking the small parts, like cell packing, and to look at the reactions that happen when you try and mimic that in cloth. But it always seems to come back to plants and the arrangements and the shapes and textures and function. On the left are some stomata cells from a plant leaf. Stomata cells are the breathing cells of a plant. They're the ones that take in the carbon dioxide. On the right, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the standard sort of onion skin cells. Really easy and fun to look at under a microscope. I keep my microscope on my desk most of the time at the moment, off the past, I don't know, quite a few years. That's another thing I grew up with as well, just having the microscope around. I should say in this, I don't have formal training in biology, but I do a lot of my own kind of investigation, but I'm very clear that I only have a very limited knowledge of that side of that biology, but I just find it fascinating. So future questions in this that are percolating away is how are these responding to the ecosystem and how do they react? And that's another thing to look at in cloth. Some of the things I'm investigating at the moment particularly are capillary actions, cell packing, function, integration, movement, and the surface. Just take another sip. So this project on the screen now is an early experiment in 3D weaving fabric behaving as plants. Hopefully you can see the kind of correlation between these images here and the stomata in the previous slide. So the first and sort of most basic question was, when I was looking at the stomata, was, can I create this in the cell shop, in a 3D cell shape built into the cloth? And it's like, maybe, quite likely, let's give it a go. But how was the big part. And just for some weaving background, multi-layered cloth is just, it just involves understanding what each layer is doing separately and controlling the order of them. So you can weave multiple of these fabrics together, and how you join them is also part of the sort of intriguing structure of it, because how you join the layers together will make a difference. So the project was woven on a digital jacquard converted from a mechanical jacquard, beautiful, beautiful machines, at the Fondazione Art della Sodalizio in Italy. They have a large number of beautiful mechanical jacquards, but they also have this digital jacquard as well. And it did make a big difference in the iterations that I went through with this project, to be able to quickly change things, because the old mechanical ones, they really are still punch cards. So there were challenges with this project in understanding how to achieve this this function within the fabric on the jacquard system. But after many hours and a very helpful mentor, I eventually got started sampling. And with some sense of pride, I have to say, initial attempts at getting the structure to work, although it sort of looks a bit simple, it caused a malfunction on the loom, so we had to readdress the patterning quite a bit so it could cope with it. That gives you sort of an idea of the differences within trying to do this kind of experimental structure. It's like sometimes you break things, and that's kind of fun in a really strange sort of way. We did fix it. The loom's fine. It was all good. Okay, so after a few iterations, we got there. And the article, if you want to read how I did it, is in the Jacquard magazine, number 72. It's 2014, I think. And the bottom middle photo, you'll notice, you can still see that sort of circular outline. That's just showing the back of the fabric. And the little bubbly bits are just where the weft is turning. But it is all fully integrated into the fabric. So it's like these the stomata cells sort of come out, literally come out of the fabric. This was my first moment, I think, where I discovered exactly how elated and how much of a kind of high I can get from achieving these kinds of structures. I was so buzzed from it. And then, of course, what follows afterwards is you get this cascade of ideas coming from it, and more ideas from those ideas. Like, immediately I want to think, how can I animate this? How can I get it moving? How can I get it functioning like a plant stomata? How can I stack it with other layers, so you get a greater density of cells, so you could have a different kind of cell underneath it as well. So that one I still think quite a lot about. So the next one, sorry, my voice is getting a little bit croaky. The next one is another project that I thought about for a long time. And I sort of title it as to getting sidetracked into hexagons, because they're another sort of thing that is never far away from my thinking in design-wise. So this piece of this sort of set of weaves came about because I was really looking a lot deeper into cell packing and certain algorithms, plant algorithms, that can create a kind of traveling hexagon like you see down the bottom left. I'd not long before I'd made this piece, or before everything kind of clicked in my mind about this piece, I'd completed a study on symmetry and unit cell translation, which included 3D molecular cell packing. And I think that was probably one of the catalysts for thinking about this in the depth of the fabric. So in that 3 dimensions, rather than the surface. Although clearly the surface, it really impacts on the surface. As I was saying, the idea was percolating for quite a while, and I ended up with a journal full of sketches like the one on the top left, just trying to figure out and think my way through different configurations and what the repercussions of those would be. But it wasn't, I have to say, it wasn't until I started weaving it that I fully understood how it was going to behave. One thing I particularly love about this piece is it removes the flat surface altogether. You literally cannot sit this piece flat. And in trying to understand that surface, I was chatting with someone from uni, the maths professor, as she was in applied maths, and about the topology of it. And she was telling me that what it's doing, although it's hard to see in some of these images, probably more easier on the blue piece down below. It's hyperbolic, and I'm still trying to get my head around that. And I still pull that, particularly that blue piece, it's very robust, unlike the pink piece. I still pull it out and just give it a bit of I have it sitting beside me and just kind of stretch it and pull it. So I think there's still something going on there with that one. So the next project I wanted to show you was this. This is all about exploring what's called 3D interlock weaving, orthogonal, and combining that with multi-layering. So I started researching more industrial engineered woven structures, particularly for things like aeronautics. If you want to look it up, NASA, if you do a Google search for NASA and 3D weaving, you find some amazing structures. So I really wanted to understand those and see what I could do with them on the hand weaving experimental kind of side of it. Initially, this one was a uni project, but I have taken it quite a bit since I did that project. Just to be able to understand it, I had to sort of create my own map of how these sort of like a lineage of how these structures work. And one of them, the interlock, it threads layers of, like this one had 5 layers, and it threads them through. Each warp goes through all the different layers and interlocks in certain ways. You can sort of get that idea from the bottom left. That's not quite the same, but it's a similar There's so many variations of it. So the experimental process for this one was a little bit more formal. It was during the end of 2020. So I only had, because of COVID, I only had limited time in the workshop. So I had to be quite structured about it. A big part of the experimentation was that I needed to modify the equipment quite a bit, particularly the front cloth beam. And this is where it's sometimes it's not just about experimenting with the cloth, it's also experimenting with the equipment, finding out its capabilities and how to get it to help you make what you want. So because this was so thick, I had to work out a different kind of a cloth beam. So it was able to wind on successfully. That weaving software that I mentioned earlier, the TextGen, really helped this one a lot. In just thinking through different permutations. That said, I still do a lot just in my sketchbook. It's sort of different levels of where and what I'm thinking about. So in the future for this one, I'd really like to explore that creating shapes within the structure. So if you look at that, particularly the middle bottom one, I'd like to create shapes with the warp threads going through in a kind of a symmetrical movement. So I'm still working my way through that one. I never really think of experiments as being static or projects as being static. They're all just part of the process. They're still trying to get somewhere. I'm not quite sure where it is, but it's just the enjoyable part of it. So this one, sorry that video always just makes me laugh. I hope you can all see it properly. This was an experiment in creating capillaries in fabric. And when I'm thinking about capillaries, it is still plant capillaries, but it's similar sort of functions. And I was looking at a lot of soft robotics and particularly pneumatics. So I have the cutest little air compressor that I use for this. It's tiny, it's about this big. And I was also looking at artificial muscle, and I really wanted to create a cloth that can hold, that can grip in different ways. So the image on the left, the video that's moving, is embedding tubing, just ordinary, well, silicon tubing. It's excellent fun to play with, but it's probably not as controlled a reaction as what I'd like. The image on the bottom row shows a project with an inner tube, sort of, it's a detail of the weave structure. But it's sort of a tube of that previous 3D angle interlock. So this is following on, this is additional experiments on that sort of premise. So I had several days of really structured experiments. I started with tubes within the fabric and attached them on one side, and I was playing about with that. And then I think the most interesting thing happened at about 4:30 in the afternoon, when I had to be out of the workshop by 5. And I just thought, I was so concentrated on attaching, keeping these tubes attached and embedded within the fabric. What if it wasn't? What if they were tubes coming out of the fabric? And so that's what, in that last half an hour, I managed to do. And it was closest to the form that I wanted to create. So I think that was a great moment of just embracing that that spontaneity of feeling and sort of trusting your gut to just have a go, really. So the next one, conscious of time too. So this one, this is some work that I did towards the end of last year. All right. And this one is all about something called Auxetic cloth. A little bit of background on this one came from, again, chatting to the same applied maths professor about surfaces. And she happened to mention that she was working on, or she specialized in a lot of auxetics. I was like, what's that? But it's so, I just want to listen to people talk like that. It just new ideas, new things to learn. It's fascinating. So she showed me some diagrams of the most simplest forms, and you can see those, the single cell, like a unit cell of those in that bottom left. So auxetics are structures that expand perpendicular to the direction they're pulled. So if you think about a rubber band and you stretch it, it gets narrower in the middle. These are structures found microscopically, usually throughout nature, and rocks, that when you pull them, they get bigger. In some of them get bigger in two directions, some one. This one gets, because it's you can see it's a line drawing, so this only gets bigger in one direction. Yeah, mostly they exist in their natural form in molecular structures, although there are a few they're finding lately in slightly larger, like cork, I think, has an auxetic structure. So I immediately, when she showed me those drawings, I immediately saw that they were similar to some of the previous hexagonal shapes I've been working on. So I had a starting point. And the profile that I wanted to explore was in the weft. So I wanted to create that line shape in the weft so it would pop the fabric. And the video at the top there shows the moment when I realized it would work. So that was pretty amazing when you sort of spend hours, and this, because it's so fine, it did take hours to do this little piece. And that moment when you testing on the loom and it just works, and it's there's nothing like it. It's so much fun. And you can find more about how I did that work, how I made that work, in a paper I recently presented at the Bridges conference. Bridges looks at a lot of maths in art, and how they can inform each other. So you can look that up on the Bridges website. So resulting experiments from that piece, the videos show the structure with shape memory alloy embedded. So I really feel like this has that element of robotic breathing, that sort of organic movement. And I had this little piece on my desk through one of the lockdowns, more recent, I think it was sort of August last year. And it sort of became like a little comfort pet in a way, because if I was sort of feeling a little bit glum, I could just flick the switch and it just kind of, it was like taking a breath. But it became like a little pet. So if you're not familiar with shape memory alloys, they react to heat. So you can send a current through them to activate them. And they work by, if they have a set state, and you can create that state through intense heat, that they'll always want to come back to. And you can bend it afterwards, then run a current through it, and it'll try to go back to that shape. And I learned a lot through this experiment, particularly when one of those little blue connections broke and I didn't notice it. So I had twice the amount of current running through one of the threads in the weaving. And because the thread that I was using was nylon, I just sat there and I watched this wire slice all through my fabric. There's nothing you could do. It was just like, it's a great learning experience. And it was a lot of fun making this piece. In the future, I really would like to explore it more reactionarily, to make it a bit more lifelike, and probably giving it some kinds of behavior rules. Yeah, and we'll move into the next one. This is the last one. This is the most recent, and it was an experiment in scale. So it's the same structure as the previous ones, just on a massive scale. The yellow ones are about 7.5 centimeters. So I think that's, trying to do my inches here, 3 inches ish. Whereas this one is 50 centimeters, and I have no idea what that is in inches. And I was using a really strong structural paper yarn to see what would happen. And even though I was trying to sort of make a larger object, I couldn't help myself. I was looking at the way different structures can morph into each other. So this end part here, sort of, I think about it as the mouth. Changes, but it's fully integrated into the next section, and kind of feels a little bit like it's like its own little entity in space. But yeah, I mean, it's being mechanically activated here, but I'd really like to put some automation into that. It was quite confronting working at such a large scale after a while. But yeah, I think there's more to do on that one. So just in summing up, my future wish list involves exploring things like generative weaving in 2 and 3 dimensions, definitely more hyperbolic weaving, tessellations within that depth of the cloth is what I was talking about with the 3D interlock. And of course, it's always going to come back to cellular structures and creating movement in the larger woven system and mimicking plants again. So what I've hoped in just a short time, what I hoped I've sort of conveyed is how I feel that by changing the perspectives about what cloth is and what cloth can be, and by viewing cloth as a complex concept field construction medium, like it's a construction medium. There are so many ways that art and design and industry, there's just so many adventures that you can have. So on that note, I'll hand it back to Laura.
Thank you so much. We'll do the, I'll try to do like a pan. Yay, keep clapping, keep clapping. Yay. Always nice to see physical humans in a 3-dimensional environment.
It is.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your talk. And it was really exciting to see more behind the projects. I mean, I think I've mined your portfolio sufficiently, but actually to see the design files and to hear more about your, I don't know, approach was really nice. I'm going to ask you one question before I turn it over to Stephen to maybe field questions from the group. And then we'll close out the talk and we'll do a little bit of questioning with the class. But my question is maybe just asking about the role of playfulness in your process, and how do you create space for playfulness?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I think I try to be more disciplined than I really am. I feel like that's a constant kind of pull of me. It's like, come on, there's a structure to this. You can do this. But really, I just want to let it go somehow. I don't want to have the constraints of having to fulfill a criteria. I don't like things in boxes, and I don't like being told I can't do something. So there's sort of always that rebellious kind of, and I think that rebellious streak will helps in finding that time to explore something properly. Yeah, I think that would be the closest. Be a bit rebellious and guard your time.
I like the productive rebellion, when that rebellion is channeled into cloth. Nice. Stephen, do you mind moderating some questions from the audience? I think let's take maybe 3.
Oh
Does that
yeah,
sound-
absolutely no problem. Thank you, Laura. And Mel, thank you so much for a great talk. I'm also getting private DMs on Instagram and Twitter about your talk, people watching it this morning, and everybody saying how inspired they were, right? This concept of being able to think about these microscopic plant structures that are these, basis for life all over the planet, and then blowing them up and thinking about them in all these different contexts. And based on that, we have some questions here, people really wanting you to, and I know you've mentioned this in different ways, but do you see these, and you kind of mentioned this in your final conclusion, but, it seems like you have lots of collaborators. Do you see the structures you make as like prototypes? Are they art? And I hate labels myself, so I just, this is a question, right? You could be like all things, which is totally valid, but that's a real question I got in a couple spots, is like, is where do you see these fitting in, or how do they connect these different disciplines that we are all cycled into?
Okay, so that's probably just as hard a question to answer. I have, particularly because doing my master's, I've got sort of not pressure exactly, but sort of subtle pressure to have this, finish something. You're going to finish something soon. Like, you should have something finished by the end. And it's like, I tried that, and it wasn't nearly as satisfying. But I don't think I'm particularly unique in enjoying the playfulness as much, like more than, not always more, but so trying to get back to the question. I don't like to think of them as finished. Some of them are proof of concept more than anything. But I think because I don't ever really think of something as being finished. It's always just a part to the next progression. And occasionally there's a point where I think, yeah, I could really make something substantial about that, and I'd like to take this one to make a thing. And I haven't really included many sort of things in the talk. It was more focused on the experiments, but the finished thing is never the focus for me. And I really discovered that this in the last semester, where my supervisor was trying to get a little bit stricter on me to finish something, and it just, I can't look at it and think it's finished. There's something else.
I love that. I love that so much. And I think as we go, have a lot of our other invited guests throughout this talk series, like, have this love of prototype, including our current artist in resident, like, thinking how these prototypes also are their own art in their own way. So we should talk more. I love this. I love this kind of thread of like being the catalyst. And thank you so much for that. Another kind of question that we have here is related to this disciplinary question, right? So you're this amazing person who's between math and science and art, and I know this is like a question like that maybe a parent would ask, but like, where from the audience, but like, where do you see yourself disciplinarily moving after you've completed your master's? Is there a direction you're hoping to move into?
I should definitely have the sort of full disclosure that I'm not trained in maths and biology at all. It's very much a sort of a it's a love of it and a love of researching that gives me that inspiration. I think I always want to work with interdisciplinary people. I think there's just so much in the world, and for me, so much in the natural world that could inform and solve problems. And that's probably more in the industrial side of it. And the art side, I think it helps people see the world in a different way. And I mean, that's a very broad art statement, but if it can help people focus and it's like notice what's around them a bit more, notice these tiny cell structures that are everywhere, that's probably most important. So I'm always somewhere between art and design, and I love industry and I love science. So not a specific industry. I don't have a specific path to go into other than continue collaborating, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, it's so funny. Craft is such a place, right? And Laura's lab, the Unstable Design Lab, as well as this place between art, between design, between science, between these spaces, right? And there's a lovely queerness to that between space, right? Where we can create our own definitions, new roles, right, and define them. And I love that about your work.
It doesn't have to have that sort of, yeah,
it's so lovely. A very straightforward question. Would you say that the majority of your weave structures are variations of double weave? Is that where you're kind of building off of some of the variations of your structures?
Probably. I mean, some of these, I mean, that last one, what did it have? 1, 2, 3, 4. That had 6 layers. So it's more sort of thinking about multi-layers, really. And even the angle interlock structures, you still think about them in layers. They're just fully integrated layers.
So when a question coming to us from a common question here is like, what steps do you take to reach? I know you talked earlier about not going towards that final product, right? But then this is like so funny. People are like, it's like, I want to see what the thing is, right? So
what do you do with it?
Yeah, what steps do you take to reach like a final product for you, right? If it's this kind of undefined thing, and are there milestones that people could think about when they're planning similar kind of interdisciplinary play? Like, how do we, if we're not working towards like an exhibition, or we're not working towards this other piece, what is the final product then, or how do we think about those milestones? For example, a conference paper, or where you're sort of feeling like the thing is completed for you. Sorry, that was really convoluted. I hope it was clear.
That's okay. It's a really interesting question. It sort of relates a little bit to previous, but I think having an interesting point, and it's a very weaverly one, is reevaluating when you finish the warp, I think. So feel free to fill the entire warp up with all these experiments that feed off each other and just go for it, and then reevaluate at the end of the warp. Really stop and look at it, step back from it. I take lots of photos, and sometimes I sketch the fabric itself and that kind of thing. Sometimes, and it'll depend a bit, but sometimes I'll have a project in mind from the start. So I'll have some sort of idea of the form, and the experiments can inform the outcome of the form, if that makes sense. That's a really tough question.
Yeah,
I'm getting into it more.
No, it's great. It comes from one of our grad students, right? So they're thinking,
okay,
cool. What are these strategies? I love this person, right? Who's like really thinking about this, liminal space, where like the finished product is maybe a collaboration or these other spaces.
Yeah.
So it's really fun to see you think through it. I know there are some great other questions in our feed, and I'm sorry we don't have time to get to them this morning. Then I'm going to hand this back over to Dr. Devendorf to finish us up.
I don't, no one calls me Dr. Devendorf. Anyway, thank you so much. And yeah, I like your idea of reevaluating at the end of the warp, because I just put 60 yards of warp on our TC2. I didn't. Lots of us did. And so that means I don't actually have to think about what I'm doing for a while, which is quite nice. But I wanted to say thank you again so much for your talk and for kicking off this series. I saw you did share your email, and if you're comfortable, maybe I'll suggest remaining questions come to you, and maybe that can sort of keep, email and Instagram and things.
And I'd like to thank you guys again very much for having me.
Yeah, it was really lovely. And I just want to remind everyone that we have more talks in this series. Our next talk will be in 2 weeks with Catherine Walters, who is also doing amazing, more than two-dimensional work. And so I look forward to more conversations. If we could all maybe drop something in the chat of a thank you, so that I feel like if we all